Book 2, Chapter 4 of Strangers and Pilgrims. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Braddon. Strangers and Pilgrims by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Book 2, Chapter 4. The company is mixed. The phrase I quote is as much as saying, "They're below your notice." For mixed company implies that save yourself and friends and 100 more, whom you may bow to without looking grave. The rest are but a vulgar set, the bore of public places, where they basely brave the fashionable stare of 20 score, of well-bred persons, call it the world. But I, although I know them, really don't know why. Bitter with unutterable bitterness was the disappointment of Aunt Chevenix when at breakfast next morning she was made acquainted with the actual state of affairs. Lord Paulo had verily proposed and had been rejected. "To say that you are mad, Elizabeth, is to say nothing," exclaimed Mrs. Chevenix, casting herself back in her chair and regarding her niece with a stony gaze, egg-spoon in hand. "You were that when you accepted Mr. Forde, but this is a besotted idiocy for which even your precious folly had not prepared me." "You surely did not think that I should jilt Mr. Forde?" "I surely did not think you would refuse Lord Paulo," echoed her aunt. "A girl of your tastes, the very last of young women to marry a person in Mr. Forde's position. Upon my word, Elizabeth, it is too bad, positively cruel, after the pride I have felt in you, the money I have spent upon you even, though I am above alluding to that. Your conduct is a death blow to all my hopes." And here Mrs. Chevenix wept real tears, which she wiped despondently from her powdered cheeks. "Pray don't cry, auntie. I'm something like a man in that respect. I can't bear the sight of tears. I am very sorry for having disappointed you, but it would be hardly a fair thing to Lord Paulo to marry him, while my heart belongs entirely to some one else, to say nothing of Malcolm himself." "Malcolm!" exclaimed Mrs. Chevenix with profound disgust. "To think that I should have a niece, my favourite niece too, capable of marrying a man called Malcolm." "I'm sorry you don't like his name, auntie. To my ear it is music." "Yes, like the Scotch bagpipes, I suppose," said the elder lady, in accents of withering scorn. "And now, dearest auntie, let there be no quarrelling between us," pleaded Elizabeth. "I dare say it is disappointing to you for me to settle down into a country clergyman's wife, after all my grand talk about marrying well, and riding through the world in my own barouche, over people's bodies, as it were, like the lady in Roman history. I did not know my own heart when I talked like that. I did not think that I should ever be weak enough to love anybody 50 times better than carriages and horses. Please let us be friends," she went on coaxingly, and kneeling down by the offended matron. "Lord Paulo has forgiven me, and he and I are to be excellent friends for the rest of our lives. Perhaps he will give Malcolm a living. I dare say he has 3 or 4 handsome benefices among his possessions." "Friends, indeed!" cried Mrs. Chevenix contemptuously. "I'm sure I thought last night that it was all settled, and even began to think of your trousseau. I never in my life had such a disappointment." Little by little, however, the matron's indignation, or the outward show of that passion, abated, and she permitted her wounded spirits to be soothed by Elizabeth's caresses. Happily for the damsel, the business of life, that business of pleasure which sometimes involves more wear and tear of mind and body than the most serious pursuit of wealth or fame, must needs go on. Once in the whirlpool of Mrs. Cinqmars' set, and there was no escape for Elizabeth and her chaperone, all their other engagements were as nothing to that lady's demands upon their time, and Mrs. Chevenix, for some unexplained reason, had entered upon a close alliance with the mistress of the Rancho. "I did not think Mrs. Cinqmars was at all your style, auntie," Elizabeth said, wondering that this new-fledged friendship should be so strong upon the wing. "Mrs. Cinqmars' style may not be faultless, but she is one of the best-natured little women I ever met, and has the art of making her house most delightful," replied Mrs. Chevenix decisively. "I think we ought to take our brass bedsteads out to Fulham, and camp under the trees, now the warm weather has set in. We almost live there as it is," said Elizabeth. There was some foundation for this remark in the fact that Mrs. Chevenix and her niece were oftener at the Rancho than anywhere else. Mrs. Cinqmars devoted all the forces of her being to the pursuit of pleasure, and as these gaieties and hospitalities assisted Mr. Cinqmars not a little in the pursuit of gain, the lady was allowed the free exercise of her talents in the art of making people forget that life was meant for anything graver or loftier than a perpetual talking of small talk, and quaffing of iced cups in the summer sunshine, now under the striped awning of a barge gliding up the sunlit river, anon in the cool shades of some primeval forest, like Windsor or Burnham beeches. If the destiny of mankind began and ended in picnics, water parties, kettle drums, and private theatricals, Mrs. Cinqmars would have been among the leaders of the world. But unfortunately for the lady, those delights are fleeting as the bubbles on the river, and however wide their circle spreads, make but brief impressions, and are forgotten after a season or two. Mr. and Mrs. Cinqmars might have commemorated themselves in a pyramid as high as Pharaoh's, built out of empty champagne bottles, but so ungrateful are the butterfly race they fed, that almost the only record of their hospitality at the end of the season was a yard full of empty bottles, and the cases which an odd man chopped up for firewood. While the season lasted, however, Mrs. Cinqmars drank freely of pleasure's sparkling cup, and found no bitterness even in the lees thereof. She rarely left a blank day in her programme. Every week brought its water party or its picnic. Every morning found her breakfast tray. She did not leave her room till the business of the day began, piled high with notes of acceptance or refusal, in answer to her coquettish little notes of invitation. She was not a person who sent meaningless cards requesting, but wrote dainty little letters on monogram emblazoned paper, full of familiar nothings, breathing the warmest friendship. "The season is so short," she used to say pensively. "One cannot do too much while the fine weather lasts." After that day at Epsom, Mrs. Cinqmars made no party to which she did not invite her dearest Miss Luttrell. She was eager for the society of her dearest Mrs. Chevenix at all her dinners and afternoons, but there were picnics and water parties which might be too fatiguing for that dearest friend, on which occasions she begged to be entrusted with the care of her sweet Miss Luttrell, a privilege the matron was not slow to accord. Dinners and dances in Tyburnia were declined with ruthlessness in favour of Mrs. Cinqmars. Aye, even a dinner in Eaton Square, at the abode of a millionaire baronet in the iron trade. "Upon my word, auntie, I don't care about going so much to Mrs. Cinqmars'," Elizabeth remonstrated. "I certainly do enjoy myself more at her parties than anywhere else, but I hardly think Malcolm would like me to spend so much time in that kind of society." "You had better send a statement of all your engagements to Mr. Forde, and allow him to direct your movements," replied Mrs. Chevenix, and mingled feelings, the fear of ridicule, and her own inclination, which drew her strongly towards Henley and Virginia Water, kept Elizabeth silent. Mr. Forde's remonstrances about the length of her visit had abated of late, for the curate had been summoned to Scotland to attend the sickbed of one of his few remaining kindred, his father's only brother, an old man to whom he was warmly attached. His letters came now from the north, and were only brief records of sufferings from which there seemed no hope of other relief than death. He had no time to write at length to his betrothed, and no spirits for letter writing. "I don't want to sadden you, dearest," he wrote, "and therefore make my letters of the briefest, for my mind is full of our patient, and the great fortitude with which he endures this protracted trial, too full even for those happy thoughts of the future which have brightened my life of late. But I do look forward to our meeting, Lizzie, whatever sorrow may lie between this hour and that, and I hope to hear speedily of your return to the West." "Do you know if this uncle is likely to leave him any money?" Mrs. Chevenix inquired, with a languid interest, when she was informed of Mr. Forde's movements. A few hundreds a year could make little difference in that poverty-stricken career which Elizabeth had chosen for herself. It would be but a grain of sand when weighed against a viscount's coronet and half a dozen estates. "I believe Malcolm will be richer, Auntie. There is a small estate in Scotland that must come to him." "A small estate in Scotland, where land rents at 10 shillings an acre, I suppose. Or perhaps it is all waste, mere sand and heather. But what does it matter? You have chosen to go through life a pauper. It is only a question of a crust of bread, more or less." There was hardly a necessity for Elizabeth to hurry back to Hawleigh, to the untimely cutting off of all these summer delights, when Mr. Forde was away. She thought how dreary the place would seem without him. Gertrude, Diana, Blanche, with their stock phrases and their perennial commonplaces and their insignificant scraps of gossip about the Hawleigh gentry, the dull old High Street, the shop windows she had looked at so often till she knew every item of the merchandise. She thought of going over all the old ground again with a shudder. Life in a convent would be gayer, she thought. The nuns could not all be Gertrudes and Dianas. So she wrote a dutiful letter to her betrothed, full of sympathy with his sorrow, and informing him that she was beginning to grow a little tired of London, and would go back to the West directly she heard of his return. "Don't ask me to go any sooner, Malcolm," she said. "The place would seem horrible to me without you. I want your face to be the first to welcome me home. I think sometimes of the days when we shall have our own home, and I shall stand at the gate watching for you." The Derby day was a thing of the remote past, and Henley Regatta was over before Elizabeth received notice of Mr. Forde's return. She had seen Lord Paulyn almost daily during the interval, and his friendship had never wavered. He was still her devoted slave, still patient under her scornful speeches, still eager to gratify her smallest caprice, still a kind of barrier between her and all other worship. Serene in the consciousness of having done her duty, of having, with a fortitude unknown to the common order of womanhood, rejected all the advantages of wealth and rank, she saw no peril to herself or her admirer in that frivolous kind of intimacy which she permitted to him. It was an understood thing that she was to be another man's wife, that the end of the season was to be her everlasting farewell to worldly pleasures. Lord Paulyn appeared to accept his position with gentlemanly-like resignation. He would even speak of his happier rival sometimes, with but little bitterness, with a good-humoured contempt, as of an inferior order of being. Elizabeth thought he was cured. Henley Regatta and the longest day were over, but the summer was yet in its prime. The nights knew not darkness, only a starry twilight betwixt sundown and sunrise. "How tired the sun must be by the end of the season," said Elizabeth, "keeping such late hours, and always glaring down upon races and regattas and flower shows and garden parties." "Don't pity him. He's such a lazy beggar, and so fond of skulking behind the clouds on rainy days," answered Lord Paulyn. I wish we could shuffle out of our engagements as easily as he shirks his." Mrs. Cinqmars, who was never happy without some grand event in preparation, had hardly given herself time to breathe after her water party at Henley, a luncheon for 25 people on board a gilded barge, towed up the river from Maidenhead, when she was up to her eyes in the arrangement of private theatricals for the 10th of July, a festivity which was to mark the close of her hospitalities. "We start for Hamburg on the 10th, she said, with a sigh, "and as I've been going up like a rocket all the season, I don't want to come down like a stick at the last. So, you see, our theatricals must be a success, Lord Paulyn. It's not to be a common drawing-room business, you know, but a regular affair for the benefit of the asylum for the widows of indigent stockbrokers. Tickets a guinea each, a few reserved fauteuils at 2 guineas. "Do you mean to say you're going to let a herd of strangers into your house?" inquired the Viscount with amazement. "Why, you'll have the swell mob after your plate." "The tickets will only be disposed of by our friends, you obtuse creature," said Mrs. Cinqmars. "But it is not half so much fun acting before a lot of people you see every day, as doing it in real earnest for a benevolent purpose. I shall expect you to sell something like £50 worth of tickets, and to bring all the heavy swells you can scrape together. I want the affair to be really brilliant. But this is not the point we have to discuss today. Before we can print our programs or stir a step in the business, we must definitely settle our pieces and cast them." This speech was uttered in a friendly little gathering beneath the umbrage of perfumed limes, the river flashing in the foreground, a few of Mrs. Cinqmars' dearest friends of both sexes, the Viscount, Major Bolding, a young man in the War Office with a tenor voice and light hair parted in the middle, the young lady with raven ringlets, a fair and dumpy young person whose husband was in America, and Elizabeth Luttrell, seated in friendly conclave round a rustic table provided with pens, ink, and paper. For it is quite impossible to achieve an arrangement of this kind without an immense waste of penmanship and letter paper. There was the usual confusion of tongues, everybody thinking he or she knew more about private theatricals than any one else. Major Bolding, because the fellows in his regiment had once got up something at Aldershot; the dumpy young person, because she had acted charades with her sisters in the nursery when she was a mite; the tenor in the War Office, because his father had known Charles Matthews the elder; the contralto, because she had gone to school with the niece of Mrs. Charles Keynes. Only Elizabeth acknowledged her ignorance. "I know nothing about plays," she said, "except that I dote upon them." "Whatever play we choose, Lizzie, I mean you to be in it," said Mrs. Cinqmars, and Elizabeth did not protest against the arrangement. She was enraptured at the thought of acting in a play, of living for one brief night the dazzling life of that fairy stage world which was so new to her. About 100 plays were suggested, briefly discussed, and rejected. Mrs. Cinqmars seemed to know every dramatic work that had been written. Every one except Elizabeth and Mr. Cinqmars had his or her one idea, by which he or she stuck resolutely. Lord Paulyn voted for Box and Cox, and could not be persuaded to extend his ideas beyond that masterpiece. The tenor proposed To Oblige Benson, because he knew some people who had acted it last Christmas down in Hertfordshire, and "I'm told it went off remarkably well, you know," he said, and people laughed a good deal, except one old gentleman in the front row, who went to sleep and snored. "You stupid people," called Mrs. Cinqmars, "don't go on harping upon one string. Those are mere insignificant farces, and I want a grand piece that will play 2 hours and a half." After this came a string of suggestions, all alike useless. "I only wish our men were a little better," said Mrs. Cinqmars, with a despondent survey of her forces. "There is a piece which I should like above all others, but it wants good acting. There are not too many people in it, and no troublesome scenery. I mean masks and faces. Everyone knew Masks and Faces. Everyone admired the play, but the gentlemen were doubtful as to their capacity for the characters. "I'll play nothing but box," said Lord Paulyn. "I think I could do that." "I don't mind what I do, as long as it's something to make the people laugh," said Major Bolding. "Then you'd better try tragedy," suggested Mr. Hartley, the tenor. "They're playing the piece at the Adelphi, Lizzie," said Mrs. Cinqmars, intent upon her own deliberations and ignoring trivial interruptions. "We'll all go to see it this evening. You shall play Peg Woffington. Major Bolding will do pretty well for Vane. Oh, yes, you must do it. I'll coach you. Cinqmars and Mr. Hartley can play Triplet and Colley Cibber. You, Flory, to the dumpy young person, will make a capital Kitty Clive. And you, Lord Paulyn, must play Sir Charles Pomander, the villain. I can get a couple of newspaper men for Snarl and Soper, the two critics. No remonstrances. I know you are all sticks, but we know what great things can be done by a couple of sticks. You'll all learn your words perfectly without an hour's delay. Never mind the acting. We'll arrange that at rehearsal. The words and the dresses are the two great points. You must all look as if you had walked out of a picture by Ward or Frith. You'll call at the Adelphi this afternoon, Major, and engage half a dozen stalls for the rest of the week. And mind, I shall expect to see them occupied every night before the curtain goes up." After this came a great deal of discussion. Major Bolding declared his incapacity for sentimental comedy. Lord Paulyn insisted that he could soar no higher than box. "I don't think I should break down in that business with this mutton chop and rasher. And if I had plaid trousers with big checks and a red wig, I think I might make them laugh a little," he said. "But my attempting a stage villain is too absurd. Why, I should have to scowl, shouldn't I, and cork my eyebrows, and drag one foot behind the other when I walked." "Nothing of the kind. Sir Charles is a light comedy villain, only a slight modification of your own haw-haw style. You have only to see the piece acted half a dozen times or so. You shall have a wig and costume that will almost play the part for you." Lord Paulyn groaned aloud. Sit in a stiflin' hot theatre 6 nights running to see the same fellers in the same play, he remonstrated. "Only a small sacrifice to dramatic art and the indigent stockbrokers' widows," said Mrs. Cinqmars soothingly. She was a determined little woman, and once having taken up the business, carried it through with unflagging energy. The programs were printed forthwith on lace-bordered paper of palest rose colour, perfumed to distraction by the art of Rimmel. Drawing-room performance at the Rancho Fulham, the riverside villa of H. du C. de Cinqmars, Esquire, for the benefit of the widows of indigent stockbrokers, members of the house alone eligible. Masks and Faces, a comedy by Charles Reade and Tom Taylor. Sir Charles Pomander, Lord Paulyn. Mr. Vane, Major Bolding. Colley Cibber, Mr. Hartley. Triplet, Mr. du Châtelain de Cinqmars. James Quinn, Mr. Beaumont. Snarl, Mr. Slasher. Soper, Mr. Slater. Critics. Mrs. Vane, Mrs. du Châtelain de Cinqmars. Kate Clive, Mrs. Desborough. Peg Woffington, Miss Elizabeth Luttrell. Tickets to be obtained only from the committee, 1 guinea. A limited number of reserved fauteuils at 2 guineas. Performance to commence at 9 precisely. Carriages may be ordered for 11:30. For 5 consecutive nights did Mrs. Cinqmars and her devoted slaves occupy the stalls of the Adelphi, gazing upon and listening to the performance of Mrs. Stirling, Mr. Benjamin Webster, and other accomplished masters of the dramatic art. The blood in the veins of the gallant Major ran cold, as the fast congealing water drops of an alpine stream among the frozen mountain tops, when he watched the movements and listened to the words of Mr. Vane. and considered that he, after his feeble fashion, must needs reflect the image of that skilful actor who sustained the part. But by diligent perusal of the comedy in the solitude of their own apartments, and by force of seeing the play 5 times running, and being urged to attention and interest by the energetic little stage manageress who sat between them, the Major on the one side and the Viscount on the other, did ultimately arrive at some idea of what they were expected to do. And when the first rehearsal took place at the Rancho, after the completion of these nightly studies, Mrs. Cinqmars pronounced herself very well satisfied with her company. She had beaten up recruits here and there in the meantime, and had filled her program. The tickets had been selling furiously. Almost every one had heard of the Rancho, and aspiring middle-class people who did not know Mrs. Cinqmars were glad of this opportunity of placing themselves upon a level with people who did. There was no rush of those lofty personages whom Mrs. Cinqmars had spoken of as heavy swells. A good deal of solicitation would have been needed to bring these to share the free and easy hospitalities of the riverside villa. But society on the lower ranges parted freely with their guineas for gilt-edged tickets of delicate rose-coloured pasteboard, entitling them to behold the mysteries of that notorious abode. Lord Paulyn, hard-pressed by the energetic Flora, did contrive to enlist the sympathies of various horsey noblemen in the cause of the stockbrokers' widows, men who were curious, in their own words, to see how big a fool Paulyn would make of himself. But stately dowagers or patrician beauties he could gather none. Major Bolding, however, beat up the quarters of wealthy merchants and ship owners, and secured a handsome attendance of diamonds and millinery for the limited number of Fotherwills. And although the aspiring soul of Mrs. Cinqmars languished for a more aristocratic assembly, she was tolerably contented with the idea of a gathering which would fill her spacious room, and in outward show would equal the best. "If one has not what one loves, one must love what one has," said the little woman, flinging back her flowing raven locks with a sigh of resignation. "We've sold all the tickets, and that's a grand point, and we shall have at least £100 for the widows. Odious, snuffy old creatures, I dare say, and not worth half the trouble we're taking for them. 1,000 thanks, Major, for your exertions in Tyburnia, and to you, Lord Paulyn, for your labours at Tattersall's. I really think we should make a success. Miss Luttrell is a magnificent Woofington." "Egad, she'd be magnificent in anything," said the Viscount rapturously. "I almost think, if there ever was such a person as Helen, she must have been like Elizabeth Luttrell. She's such an out-and-out beauty. Don't you know in Homer, when she came out on the ramparts where the old men were sitting, though I dare say they'd have been abusing her like old boots before she showed up, the moment they saw her they knocked under, and thought a 10 years' war was hardly too much to have paid for the privilege of looking at her. Elizabeth is just that kind of woman. It's no matter how she carries on, a man must adore her." "I say ditto to Mr. Burke," said the Major. "It's a pity she should marry a country parson, isn't it?" asked Mrs. Cinqmars, who had been made acquainted with Elizabeth's engagement by the damsel herself in a moment of confidence. 50 to 1 against that marriage ever coming off," said the Major. "A pretty girl always begins with a detrimental just to get her hand in. I dare say those Gunning sisters in King George's time were engaged to some needy beggars before they came up to London and took the town by storm. I can't fancy Miss Luttrell settling down to the goody-goody kind of life with a sanctimonious fellow in a white choker." "No, by Jove!" cried Lord Paulyn. "I can fancy anything sooner than that. But she's just the sort of girl to do anything, however preposterous, if she once sets her mind upon it." This was a fragment of confidential talk in Mrs. Cinqmars' boudoir, which at this period was littered with court swords, three-cornered hats, flowing periwigs, and other such paraphernalia. The important night came at last, in an interval of tropical weather. The thermometer at 86 in the shade, all the greensward in the parks burnt to a dismal tawny hue, arid as a simoon-blasted desert. Heavy, insupportable weather, at which Anglo-Indians and other travelers in distant climes, from China to Peru, grumbled sorely, declaring that they had encountered nothing so oppressive as this sultry English heat in Bengal, or Japan, or Lima, or Honolulu, as the case might be. A damp, penetrating heat, as of a gigantic hothouse. London and her wide-spreading suburbs were wrapped in a dim shroud of summer mist, pale and impalpable as the ghost of some dead-and-gone November fog, and all the denizens of the vast city seemed visibly dissolving as in a Turkish bath. Threatening weather, with the perpetual menace of a thunderstorm impending in the leaden sky. "It would be rather too bad if the storm were to come tonight," said Mrs. Cinqmars, as she leaned against the embrasure of an open window languidly, after the last rehearsal, which had been prolonged to within a couple of hours of the performance. "But I shouldn't at all wonder if it did. Hark at those horrible little birds twittering, as if they were saying, 'Oh, yes, it will come soon. It can't keep off much longer. I feel it coming.' And how the laurel leaves shiver." "We've sold the tickets," said the Major philosophically. "The indigent widows will be none the worse off if it rains bucketfuls all the evening." "Do you think that will reconcile me to our play being a failure?" cried the lady indignantly. "As if those snuffy old things were the first consideration." "But you do it for their sakes, you know." "For their sakes? Do you suppose I pay Madame Noor unheard-of prices for my dresses for their sakes? I shall die of vexation if we've any empty benches." "We'd better send a whip round to the clubs," said Major Bolding. "I don't want a herd of men," exclaimed the aggrieved manageress. "I want a brilliant-looking audience. Those Manchester and Liverpool women with their emeralds and diamonds. However, we'd better disperse at once and begin to think of dressing. 2 hours is not too much for putting on pompadour costumes. Lizzie, you and I will have some tea and cold chicken in my room, if we can manage to eat. And as for you gentlemen, there will be dinner in half an hour in Mr. Cinqmars' study. All the other rooms are confiscated to the interests of the widows." "Are the widows to see us act?" inquired Mr. Hartley. "They ought, I think, in order to appreciate the effort we are making for them at its just value. It would be rather a clever move, by the way. A row of old women in black bonnets. Mrs. Cinqmars could point to them when she speaks her little epilogue. 'Behold, kind friends, the recipients of your bounty.' It will be quite enough to speak of them. And now, gentlemen, if you really mean to be dressed by 9 o'clock, you better go to your rooms. Du Châtelet, be sure you come to me at 8:45 to go over your scenes for the very last time." Du Châtelet groaned. He was the triplet of the piece, and had sorely toiled in his laudable desire to reproduce the looks and tones of Mr. Webster. He had even sacrificed a handsome black moustache, which he felt to be a costly offering on the shrine of art. It was 9 o'clock, and the storm was still impending, still spreading its dark curtain between earth and the stars. But it had not come, and carriage after carriage, the chariots of Tyburnia and Ecclestonia, rolled round the gravel sweep before the broad portico of the Rancho. The foyer filled rapidly with a pleasant rustling of silks and satins, a fluttering of plumes and flashing of jewels, until the half-dozen rows of luxurious seats became a very flower garden, the brilliant colours of the more costly sex only agreeably toned by the Puritan garb of man. The billiard-room had been fitted up as an auditorium, and by a skilful removal of the vast window which filled one end of the room and opened on the garden, the apartment had been extended into a temporary shed beyond. This shed, with gently sloping floor and sunk footlights was the stage. The frame of the window, wreathed with flowering creepers, which seemed to have grown up after the fashion of the famous beanstalk, formed the proscenium. The brilliant light in the auditorium sank gently to a semi-darkness as the band, hidden in a little off-room, attacked the overture to Masaniello. People had just time enough to look about them before the lights went down, the women surveying one another's dresses, the men looking about for people they knew. Mrs. Cinqmars beheld her audience through a hole in the curtain, which Major Bolding had made with his penknife for her convenience, and was satisfied. "They look very well, don't they?" she asked. "You'd hardly think they were not the real thing, not hallmarked, only electroplated." Mrs. Chevenix occupied one of the fauteuils, in a cool and somewhat juvenile costume of pale grey silk and areophane, with pink ribbons, and a blonde Marie Stuart cap surmounted with pink marabouts edging her fan, pink swansdown on her gloves. Her own dress was new, and had cost money, but the cost thereof was of nothing compared with the expense of Elizabeth's satin train and point-laced flounced petticoat, and the powdered wig which was to make her look like Madame de Pompadour in Boucher's famous picture. Yet all this expenditure had the devoted aunt borne without grumbling, or only an occasional faint and plaintive sigh. If there were sufficient recompense for this outlay in Elizabeth's triumph, Mrs. Chevenix received such recompense without stint. From the first moment to the last of that performance, the girl was triumphant, resplendent with beauty and genius, giving her whole heart and soul to the magic of the stage, living, breathing, thinking, as Peg Woffington. The mediocrity of her fellow actors mattered nothing to her. They spoke the words they had to speak, so that no hitch arose in the stage business, and that was all she needed to sustain the illusion of the scene. There was passion enough and force enough in her own soul to have animated a theatre. There was an electricity as subtle as the electricity in the overcharged atmosphere, a magnetic force which inspired and excited instead of depressing. Mrs. Cinqmars revelled in the sentimentalities of Mabel Vane, rolled her large eyes, and flung about her superb hair. She would wear no wig to conceal that natural abundance to her heart's content, and made a graceful little heroine of the lachrymose school. But Elizabeth was the very creature one could fancy Margaret Woffington in her prime. The generous, reckless, audacious beauty, proud of her power over the hearts of men, brimming over with life and genius, but with unfathomable depths of tenderness lurking beneath that brilliant surface. Tyburnia and Ecclestonia, and all the men about town who formed the staple of Mr. and Mrs. Cinqmars' set, applauded with a unanimity that for once in a way came from the heart. They felt that this was verily dramatic art, hardly the less finished because it was the fruit of only a fortnight's study. The actress had picked up the technicalities of her part during those studious nights in the theatre. Inspiration and a fresh and ardent love of art had done the rest, and the impersonation was as perfect as any amateur performance could possibly be, with all the added charm of freshness and sincerity which can hardly accompany the profound experience of professional training. An actress who had trodden the beaten round of the drama more or less like a horse in a mill could surely never fling herself with such passionate feeling into one part as this girl, to whom the magic of the stage was new. Mr. Cinqmars quavered and sniffed and snivelled in the character of Triplet, with an abject senility which would have been senile in a great-grandfather of 90, but copied the stage business with some dexterity, and won his share of applause. Lord Paulyn and Major Bolding were dressed superbly, and managed to get through their work with credit to themselves and the stage manageress, and as coffee and Neapolitan ices were lavishly administered between the two acts, without any toll being extracted thereupon for the widows, the aristocracy of commerce in the 2-guinea fauteuils were inclined to think they had received fair value for their money. As for the herd of young men who blocked the back of the auditorium, where there was little more than standing room, they were simply in ecstasies. The girl's beauty and genius fired their souls. They protested vehemently that she ought to go on the stage, that she would take the town by storm, and much more to the same effect. Forgetting that this flame, which burned so brilliantly tonight, might be only a meteoric light, and that although a clever young woman with an ardent nature may for once in her life fling herself heart and soul into a stage play, and by a kind of inspiration dispense with the comprehension and experience that can only come from professional training, it is no reason she should be able to repeat her triumph, and to go on repeating it ad libitum. Never again in Elizabeth Luttrell's existence was she able to live the delicious life of the stage, to lose the sense of her personality in the playwright's creation, to act and think and be glad and sorry with an imaginary creature, the center of an imaginary world. Among the crowd of white neckties and swallow-tailed coats at the end of the room there was one gentleman who stood near the door, with his back against the wall, a tall, immovable figure, and who seemed to know nobody. He was taller by half a head than the majority of the men standing in the crowded space behind the last row of seats, and he was able to survey the stage across the carefully parted hair of the gentleman in front of him. This gentleman had a good deal to say about Elizabeth Luttrell, to which the stranger listened intently, with a somewhat moody countenance. "Yes," said this fopling to his friend, in the interval between the second and third act. The stranger had only entered the room towards the close of the second. "Yes, it is a great match for her, of course. Only a country parson's daughter without a sixpence, except anything she may get from her aunt, Mrs. Chevenix, the widow of a man who was a bishop or a judge or something." "Is it a settled thing?" asked the other. "Of course it is. Why, they go everywhere together. I was introduced to her at the Derby. He drove her down in his drag, with Mrs. Cinqmars to play propriety on the obscurum facere per obscurius principle, I suppose. And you'll find him here continually dancing attendance upon Miss Luttrell, and spooning to an extent that is humiliating to one's sense of manhood. I didn't think that was in Paulin's line. I thought he went in for race horses and prize yachts, and that kind of thing." "Yes, there's the rub. This is his first appearance in the character of a love-sick swain, and like a patient who takes the measles late in life, he exhibits the disease in its most aggravated form." "There's not much in him at the best of times," said the other, with the air of a man whose own intellectual gifts were of the highest order, and who therefore surveyed mankind from an altitude. "Do you think she likes him?" "Do I think she's in full possession of her senses?" answered his friend, laughing. "And that being so, she would be likely to turn up her nose at such a position as he can give her. There's hardly a richer man than Paulin about town, bar the Marquis of Westminster. The love of money is an hereditary vice in his family, and his ancestors have scraped and hoarded from generation to generation. He's one of the few gentlemen who contrive to make money on the turf. The bookmen hate him like poison. He's a lamb they seldom have the privilege of skinning. There isn't a deeper card out, and I can't say I envy that lovely girl the life she's likely to lead with him when she's his own property and he gets tired of spooning. But for all that, I don't believe there's a girl in London would have refused him." Pleasant intelligence this, for the tall stranger, whose name was Malcolm Forde. End of Book 2, Chapter 4. Recording by John Braddon. Book 2, Chapter 5 of Strangers and Pilgrims. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Braddon. Strangers and Pilgrims by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Book 2, Chapter 5.
Et je songeais comme la femme oublie, et je sentais un lambeau de ma vie qui se déchirait lentement.
Mr. Ford had come up from Scotland on the 10th of July, intending to surprise Elizabeth by his unexpected appearance in Eaton Place. He had fancied her bright look of rapture as she came into the room and saw him, after having been told only that a gentleman from Hawleigh wished to see her. The look she had given him so many times during the brief happy fortnight that followed their betrothal, those happy days in which they had enjoyed for but too short a space the privileges of plighted lovers, had walked alone together on the dull March afternoon when the curate's labours allowed him such a blessed interval, and had talked of the future they were to share, a lowly destiny, but with the light of true love shining upon it. Thus had he thought of his betrothed during the tedious journey from the north, tedious though he travelled express for the greater part of the way. He came fresh from the performance of a mournful duty, for only 2 days ago he had read the funeral service above the remains of his father's brother, the bachelor uncle, who had been almost a second father to him. He had not even written to tell Elizabeth of his uncle's death. It would be easier to tell her when they met. He had made all his plans. He meant to stay in London for a few days, while Elizabeth wound up her visit, and then to take her back to Devonshire with him. And then it would be time to think of their wedding day. He was richer by some 400 a year since his uncle's death, and he had lately received the offer of a very fair living in the north of England. Since he had surrendered his old heroic idea of his ministry, and had determined that his lines were to be cast in pleasant places, there was really nothing to hinder the realization of his wishes. Only when he was rattling along in a cab between Euston Square and Eaton Place did he bethink himself that Elizabeth would in all probability be out. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and she went out so much, as her letters informed him. He could hardly hope to be so fortunate as to find her at home. And then he reproached himself for this childish foolishness of his in wishing to surprise her, instead of telegraphing the announcement of his advent, as a sensible man would have done. Do love and folly always go hand in hand, he wondered. His forebodings of disappointment were fully realized. Not at home, said Mrs. Chevenix's single-handed indoor servant, a man whose pompous bearing might have impressed strangers with the idea that he had an under-butler and a staff of accomplished footmen for his vassals. Not expected home till late this evening. Mr. Ford had alighted from his cab and stood in the stuccoed porch, despondent. "Have you any idea where they're gone?" he asked. Any idea, indeed? Why, the butler was as familiar with his mistress's engagements as that lady herself. "They are gone to the amateur theatricals at the Rancho, Mr. Cinqmarsh's place at Fulham." "Amateur theatricals?" repeated Malcolm hopelessly. "Yes," replied the butler, who was of a communicative disposition. "My Mrs. niece, Miss Luttrell, acts the principal character, and my Mrs. maid, as has seen her rehearsalling, and has gone down to dress her this evening, says she do hack wonderful, just like the regular thing, only not so low. It's a pity you didn't buy a ticket, sir, as you're a friend of the family." Private theatricals, and his wife-elect the centre of observation? He was not straight-laced or puritanical in his ideas, but this performance hardly seemed to him in harmony with the part she had elected to play in the drama of life. But she had been minded to taste the cup of pleasure, and she was evidently drinking its strongest waters. She had told him nothing of these amateur theatricals. A curious reticence. "Buy a ticket?" he repeated, echoing the friendly butler. "Do you mean the tickets have been sold? It is a public business, then?" "Well, sir, it is and it isn't, as you may say. The performance is for the benefit of a charitable institution, the Indigent Widows, and Mrs. Cinqmars have kindly lent her house for the occasion, and the tickets have only been sold by the committee. So you see it's public from one point of view and private from the other." "Where could I get a ticket?" asked the curate moodily. This public exhibition, this playing at charity, was just the very last thing he could have desired for his future wife, just the very thing he would have forbidden at any cost had he been afforded the opportunity of forbidding it. "And to keep it hidden from me," he thought, "a bad beginning to that perfect trust which was to reign between us." "I don't know as you could get one anywhere tonight, sir," replied the butler thoughtfully, "unless I was to get it for you. My missus is on the committee, and I know she had a lot of tickets to sell, and kept 'em up to yesterday in a china basket in the drawing room. If they're there still, I might take the liberty of getting one for you, being for a charitable purpose. I don't think missus would object to my disposin' of one." "Give me one, then, like a good fellow." "The tickets are a guinea each," said the butler doubtfully, thinking this eager gentleman might ask for credit. Mr. Forde took a handful of loose money from his pocket. "Here are 30 shillings," he said. "A guinea for the ticket, and the balance for your trouble." The man was gratified by this donation, for in these degenerate days vails are an uncertain quantity. He produced the ticket speedily, instructed Mr. Forde as to the nearest way to the rancho, guarded the wheel of the hansom as he got into it, and delivered the curate's address to the charioteer with as grand an air as if he had been instructing the coachman of an archbishop. "British Hotel, Cockspur Street," he said, and thither Mr. Forde was driven by way of Belgrave Square and Birdcage Walk. A nota bene on the gilt-edged ticket informed him that full dress was indispensable. He dined hastily in the deserted coffee-room, a sorry dinner, for he was in that frame of mind in which dining is the most dismal mockery, a mere sacrifice to the conventionalities. Dined, and then went to his room and dressed hurriedly, with his thoughts strangely disturbed by this trivial business of the private theatricals. But it was not trivial, for Elizabeth's reticence had been a tacit deception. It was not trivial, for unless she had been utterly wanting in love's truthful instinct, she must have known that this public exhibition of herself would be of all things the most hateful to him. He was not a tyrant. He had never meant to tyrannize over this fair young creature who had made him love her in very spite of his own will, but he had meant to mould her into the shape of his own fairer ideal, the woman whose claim to manly worship was somewhat higher than the splendour of her eyes or the golden glory of her hair, the perfect woman, nobly planned. He had fondly hoped that in Elizabeth there was the material for such a woman, that he had only to play the sculptor in order to develop undreamt of graces from this peerless block of marble. There were some letters waiting for him at the British, letters which had been sent on from Lenorgie, where they arrived after his departure. He had spent the day and night after the funeral with a friend in Edinburgh, where he had business to transact. 2 were mere business epistles. The third was in a hand that was strange to him, rather a singular hand, with straight up and down letters, but of an angular, scratchy type, which he felt must be feminine. It bore the postmark of Hawley. It was that snake in the grass, an anonymous letter. Mr. Forde will be perhaps surprised to learn that Miss Luttrell has given much encouragement to an aristocratic admirer during her stay in London. She has been seen on the front seat of Lord Paulyn's 4-in-hand, returning from Epsom races, a circumstance which has occasioned some talk among the straight-laced inhabitants of Hawley. This friendly hint is sent by a sincere well-wisher. Hawley, July 7th. An aristocratic admirer, Lord Paulyn? She has suffered her name to be associated with his so much as to give an excuse for this venomous scrawl. I will not believe it. The venom is self-engendered. This vile letter is from some envious woman who hates her for all the gifts that render her so much more charming than other women. He crushed the venomous scrawl in his strong hand, and thrust it into the depths of a remote pocket. Yet, however mean the spirit of the anonymous slanderer, however contemptible the slander, it stung him not the less, as such venom does sting, in spite of himself. I shall see her face to face, he thought, in an hour or two, shall be able to scold her for her folly, and take her to my heart for her penitence, and be angry with her, and forgive her, and adore her in the space of a minute. And I shall see the scorn in her proud eyes when I tell her she has been accused of encouraging my rival. The drive to the rancho gave Mr. Forde ample leisure for thought, for going over and over the same ground, with an agonizing repetition of the same ideas, for the amplification of those vague doubts, those little clouds in love's heaven, no bigger than a man's hand, until they grew wide enough to darken all the horizon. The shades of Fulham seemed endless. He stopped the driver more than once to ask if he were not going wrong, but the man told him no. He knew Bishop's Lane well enough, close again Putney Bridge, and the locality of the rancho, as indicated by Mr. Forde's ticket, was Bishop's Lane. They drove into the lane at last, a dismal by-road between high walls, just wide enough for a couple of carriages to pass each other, with imminent peril of grazing the wheels, or the horses against a wall. One could hardly have expected to find a suburban paradise in such a neighborhood, and in spite of his preoccupation, Mr. Forde looked about him with surprise, as the hansom dashed in at an open gateway, made a swift circuit of a dark shrubbery of almost tropical luxuriance, and anon drew up before a long, low house, lighted like a fairy palace. He gave his ticket to a functionary who looked like a professional box-keeper, and was admitted to a spacious chamber filled to overflowing with a fashionable-looking audience. The play was more than half over. There was only standing room, and the central figure of the group on the brightly lighted stage, the focus of every eye, was the girl he loved, the perfect woman, nobly planned, etc. He was but mortal, so he could not withhold his admiration of her grace and beauty, and was half inclined to forgive her because she was so lovely and gracious a creature. Then the curtain fell at the close of the second act, and the men in front of him began to talk of her, and he heard what the world thought of Elizabeth Luttrell. The blow almost stunned him. He heard much more than has been recorded, heard how men talked of his perfect woman, heard Mrs. Chevenix's manoeuvres freely discussed, and Elizabeth's cooperation in all the matron's schemes spoken of as an established fact. His first and almost irresistible impulse was to knock the slanderers down. He felt as unregenerately minded upon the point as if he had come fresh from the mess table. His brain fired with wine and laughter. But he conquered the inclination and stood quietly by, and heard from the lips of some half-dozen speakers what the world thought of the woman he loved. It was not that anything specially ill-natured was said. The men hardly knew that their remarks were derogatory to womanly dignity. It was their way of discussing such topics. But for Malcolm Forde it meant the ruin of that new scheme of life which he had made for himself. The airy fabric built by hope and love perished, like an enchanted city that melts into thin air at the breaking of a spell. He did not for a moment suspend his judgment, did not stay his wrath to consider how much or how little justification there might be for this careless talk. These men spoke of facts, spoke of Elizabeth's engagement to the Viscount as a fact concerning which there could be no doubt, and she had doubtless given them ample justification for this idea. She had been constantly seen in his society, he spooning, odious word, in a manner that made his passion obvious to the eyes of all men. Could he take this woman, her purity forever tarnished by such contact, home to his heart? Was such a woman, who with her faith plighted to him, could surrender herself to all the follies of the town, and link her name with yonder profligate, was such a woman worthy of the sacrifice he had been prepared to make for her, the sacrifice of the entire scheme of his life, theory and practice, alike abandoned for her sake? She would have made me a sensuous fool, he thought, content to dawdle through life as her father has done, living at my ease, and making coals and beef and blankets the substitute for earnest labor among my flock. What might she have made of me if my eyes had not been opened in time? I loved her so weakly. He put his passion already in the past tense. He had no thought of the possibility of his forgiving the woman who had deceived him so basely. Of course she meant all the time to marry Lord Paulyn, if he proposed to her. But in the meanwhile, for the mere amusement of an idle hour, she made love to me, he thought bitterly, remembering that nothing had been farther from his thoughts than proposing to Elizabeth when she laid in wait for him that March night, and cut off his retreat forever with the fatal magic of her beauty and the tones and looks that went straight to his heart. He must see her as soon as the play was over, must cast her out of his life at once and forever, must make a swift, sudden end of every link between them. I might write to her, he thought, but perhaps it would be better for us to meet once more face to face. If it is possible for her to justify herself, she shall not be without the opportunity for such justification. But I know that it is impossible. When the curtain had fallen for the last time, and Elizabeth had curtsied her acknowledgment of a shower of bouquets, and the enthusiasm in the parterre was still at its apogee, Mr. Forde departed. Not tonight would he break in upon her new existence. Let her taste all the delights of her triumph. Tomorrow would be time enough for the few quiet words that were needed for his eternal severance from the woman he had loved. End of Book 2, Chapter 5. Recording by John Braddon. Book 2, Chapter 6. Of Strangers and Pilgrims. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Braddon. Strangers and Pilgrims by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Book 2, Chapter 6. Since there's no help, come, let us kiss and part. Nay, I have done. You get no more of me. And I am glad, yea, glad with all my heart, that thus so cleanly I myself can free. Shake hands forever, cancel all our vows, and when we meet at any time again, be it not seen in either of our brows, that we one jot of former love retain. Elizabeth was sitting alone in the shady back drawing-room on the morning after her triumph, carelessly robed in white muslin, pale, exhausted, languid, as the lady in Hogarth's Marriage a la Mode. Mrs. Chevenix was recruiting her forces, mental and physical, by prolonged and placid slumbers, but Elizabeth was not of the order of being who could sleep off the fumes of dissipation so easily. Her brief night had been a perpetual fever, the voice of adulation still in her ears, the lights, the faces of the crowd still before her dazzled eyes, the passion and feeling of Peg Woffington still racking her heart. I wonder actresses don't all die young, she thought, as she tossed her weary head from side to side, vainly seeking slumber's calm haven. Now she was lying on the sofa, prostrate, an unread novel in her hand, a cup of tea on a tiny table by her side, a fan and scent bottle close at hand, for she had taken to her aunt's manner of sustaining life in its feebler moments. She threw aside her novel presently and unfurled her fan. I wish I was really an actress, she thought. That would be a life worth living. To hear that thunder of applause every night, to see every eye fixed upon one, a vast audience listening with a breathless air, and to move in a strange world, a world of dreams, and to love and suffer and despair and rejoice within the compass of a couple of hours. Yes, that is life. She smiled to herself as she wondered what her lover would think of such a life. I shall tell him all about it now that it is over, she said to herself. If I had told him before, he would have given his veto against the whole business, I dare say. But he can hardly be very angry when I make a full confession of my misdemeanor, especially as it was for a charity. And I think he will be a little proud of my success, in spite of himself. There had been a dance at the rancho after the general public had dispersed, and Elizabeth had been the star of the evening, the object of everybody's outspoken admiration. All the performers had been praised, of course. Mr. Cinqmars for his lifelike rendering of Triplet, in which personation he was declared by some enthusiastic friends to have rivaled Webster and Lemaitre. Mrs. Cinqmars for her pathos and charming appearance as Mabel Vane, Lord Paulyn and the Major for their several merits, but no one attempted to disguise the fact that Elizabeth's had been the crowning triumph. Enthusiastic young men told her that she ought to go on the stage, that she would take the town by storm, and make 10,000 a year, and so on. Lord Paulyn told her, but that was only a repetition of what he had told her before. You promised you would never speak of that subject again, she said. It was in a waltz, as they were whirling round to the Soldaten Lieder. I shall speak of it till my dying day, he said. Yes, if it makes you ever so angry. Remember what I told you. I swore an oath the day I saw you first. I will never dance with you again. Oh, yes, you will. But I tell you what you will never do. You will never marry that parson fellow. It isn't possible. that after having seen what the world is, and your own capacity for shining in it, you could lead such a life as you'd have to lead with him." "Ah, that's because you don't know how much I love him," the girl answered with a radiant look. "I'd rather be shut up in a convent like Heloise and exist upon an occasional letter from him than have all the pleasures of the world without him." "Bosh," said the Viscount bluntly. "A week of the convent would make you tell another story. Your fancy for this man is one of your caprices, and heaven knows you're about the most capricious woman in the world. You like him because everyone is opposed to your marrying him, because it's about the maddest, most suicidal thing you could do." "I'm tired," said Elizabeth. "Take me to my seat, please." And having once released herself from him, she took care that Lord Paulyn should have no further speech with her that night. She thought of his impertinences this morning as she lay on the sofa listlessly fanning herself, thought of his obstinate pursuit of her, and thought with some touch of pride in her own superiority to sordid considerations how very few young women in her position would have held out against such a siege. She was in the midst of a half-stifled yawn when the pompous butler opened the door in his grand sweeping way and announced Mr. Forde. She sprang to her feet, her heart beating violently, her tired eyes brightening with sudden joy, and seemed as if forgetful of the scarcely departed butler. She would have flung herself into her lover's arms. Her lover! Alas, was that a lover whose grave eyes met hers with so cold a gaze? She drew back, appalled by that strange look. "Malcolm," she cried, "what is the matter?" "There is so much the matter, Miss Luttrell, that I hesitated this morning as to whether I should write you a brief note of farewell, or come here to bid you my last good-bye in person." The girl drew herself up with her queenliest air, trembling with a strange inward shiver. Sick at heart, cold as death, she yet faced him resolutely, ready to see the ship that carried all her freight of hope and gladness go down to the bottom of the ocean without one cry of despair. "It was at least polite to call," she said loftily. "May I ask what has caused this abrupt change in your plans?" "I think it is scarcely needful for you to inquire, but I have no wish to be otherwise than outspoken. I was at your friend's house last night and saw you. I hope you were not very much shocked by what you saw." Not for worlds would she now have apologized for her conduct, or explained that she had intended to tell him all about the amateur performance at the Rancho when it was over. "I might have forgiven what I saw, though, if you had known my mind in the least. You must have known how unwelcome such an exhibition would be to me." "Did I play my part so badly, then?" she asked, with a little offended laugh, womanly vanity asserting itself even in the midst of her anguish. "Did I make so great a fool of myself?" He took no notice of the inquiry, but went on with suppressed passion, standing before her, his broad muscular hand grasping the back of one of Mrs. Chevenix's fragile chairs, which trembled under the pressure. "I heard your attractions, your opportunities, your future discussed very freely between the acts of your comedy. I heard of your engagement to Lord Paulyn." "My engagement to Lord Paulyn!" she cried, staring at him with widening eyes. "Yes, a fact which I found confirmed this morning by one of the newspapers in the coffee room where I breakfasted." He gave her a copy of the Court Journal. "You will see your name there among the announcements of impending marriages in high life. A marriage is on the tapis between Lord Paulyn and Miss Luttrell, daughter of the Reverend Wilmot Luttrell, Vicar of Hawleigh. It was rather hard that you should allow the court newsman to be wiser than I." Eager words of denial trembled on her lips, but before they could be spoken, pride silenced her. What! He came to her in this ruthless fashion, came with his course resolved, and resigned her as coolly as if she were a prize not worth contesting. "You have come here to give me up," she said. "I have resigned myself to circumstances. But would it not have been as well to be off with the old love before you were on with the new? It is a matter of little consequence, perhaps, to the new love, but it is not quite fair to the old. You have not taken the trouble to think that this paragraph may be a newsmonger's unlicensed gossip, as meaningless as the talk you may have heard last night." He looked at her earnestly. No, there was neither penitence nor love in that cold, beautiful face, only pride and anger. Was it the same face that had looked at him passionately in the moonlight 4 months ago? Was this the woman who had almost offered him her love? "Even if this announcement is somewhat premature, I've learned enough to know that it is only premature, that it must come in due course, unless indeed you are more reckless of your reputation than I could have supposed it possible for your father's daughter to be. Your name has been too long associated with Lord Paulyn's to admit of any termination but one to your acquaintance. For your own sake, I recommend you to marry him." "I am hardly likely to despise such generous advice. If you had ever loved me," with a sudden burst of passion, "you could not talk to me like this. I have loved you well enough to falsify the whole scheme of my life, to sacrifice the dearest wish of my mind." "But it was such an unwilling sacrifice," exclaimed Elizabeth bitterly. "God forbid that I should profit by it." "God only knows how much I have loved you, Elizabeth, for He alone knows the strength of my temptation and the weakness of my soul. But you were only playing at love, and the romantic ardour which you assumed, with so fatal a charm, with so facetious a sentiment, that it could not weigh for a single hour against your love of pleasure, or stand between your ambition and its object for a single day. Let it pass, with that dead past to which it belongs. The dream was sweet enough while it lasted, but it was only a dream, and it has gone like the chaff of the summer threshing floors." She stood like a statue, hardening her heart against him. What, when all the world as represented by Lord Paulyn and society at the Rancho, was at her feet, did he cast her off so lightly, without allowing her any fair opportunity of justifying herself? For it was hardly to be supposed that she would kiss the dust beneath his feet, as it were, confessing her sins and supplicating his pardon. What had she done? Only enjoyed her life for this one brief summer time, holding his image in her heart of hearts all the while. Yes, in the very whirlpool of pleasure, looking upward at him, as at a star seen from the depths of a storm-darkened sea. And she had refused Park Lane, Cowes, Ashcombe, and 2 more county seats for his sake. Should she tell him of her rejection of Lord Paulyn, tell him that one incontrovertible fact which must reinstate her at once and forever in his esteem? What, tell him this when he spoke of his love as a thing of the past, a dream that he had dreamed and done with, a snare which he had happily escaped, regaining his liberty of election, his freedom for that grander life in which human love had no part? What, sue again for his love, lay bare his passionate heart again, overstep the boundary line of womanly modesty, remind him how she had been the first to love, almost the first to declare her love? Had he not this moment reminded her inferentially of that most humiliating fact? Thus argued pride, and sealed her lips. Hope spoke still louder. Let him talk as he might, he loved her, and could no more live without her than she could exist, a reasonable creature, without him. Let him leave her, let him renounce her. He would come back again. would be at her feet pleading for forgiveness, himself the acknowledged sinner, his the humiliation. In that brief, happy courtship, in those twilight rambles on the outskirts of Hawleigh, when for one delicious hour in the day they had been all the world to each other, Malcolm had laid his heart bare before her, had confessed all the anguish that his efforts not to adore her had cost him. "I have heard of men making as strong a stand against infidelity," he said, "but I doubt if any man ever before fought so hard a fight against a sinless love." "I must be very horrid," the girl answered in her frivolous way, "or you would scarcely have taken so much trouble to shut the door of your heart against me." "You are all that is lovely and adorable," he said, "but I had made up my mind to be a Francis Xavier on a small scale, and you came between me and my cherished dreams." She remembered these things today, as she stood with locked lips and cold, scornful eyes, confronting him, resolved that from him alone should come the first attempt of reconciliation. "Having renounced me," she said at last, after a pause, in which he had waited, heaven knows with what passionate eagerness for any denial or supplication from her, "in so deliberate and decisive a manner, I conclude you have nothing more to say, except, indeed, to tell me to what address I shall send your letters and presents." This home thrust, she fancied, must needs bring him to his senses. "Destroy them all," he said savagely. "They are the memorials of a most miserable infatuation." "As you please," she answered coolly, preserving that outward semblance of an unshaken spirit to the last, acting her part of indifference and disdain far better than he played his. Had she not her experience of last night to help her? This morning's interview was no whit the less a scenic display, an actress's representation of supreme calm, with the strong tide of a woman's passion swelling and beating in her stormy breast all the while. "Then there is nothing more," he said quietly, but with the quietness of suppressed passion, and with no attempt to conceal his emotion, only trying to carry himself manfully in spite thereof, "except for us to say good-bye. Let it be a friendly farewell, Elizabeth, for it is likely to be a long one." She looked at him curiously. That was hardly the tone of a man who meant to retrace his steps, to leave her in anger today, only to come back to her repentant tomorrow. No, there was no room to doubt his earnestness. He did mean this farewell to be irrevocable, this parting for ever and ever. It was only when he had turned his back upon her, when the door was shut between them, that he would discover how impossible it was for them to live apart. There must be some reciprocity in these things, she thought. He could not be so much to me, a part of my very life, and I nothing to him. He must come back to me. He held out his hand, and she gave him hers, and suffered it to remain helpless, unresisting, in his strong grasp, while he spoke to her. "Elizabeth," he said, "there are some things very hard to forgive. It is hard for me to forgive you the delusive joys of the last few months, the sharp delight I felt that March night, when for the first time in my life passionate love had full mastery over my heart, and all the world seemed to begin and end in you. It is bitter to look back upon that hour today, and I know that I was the veriest slave of a delusion, the blindest fool of a woman's idle fancy. But I did not come here to reproach you. The dream is past, you might have spared me the sharpness of this sudden waking. But even that I will try to forgive you. Goodbye." He looked at her with a sad, strange smile, the firm lips set in their old resolute curve, but with an unwonted tenderness in the earnest eyes. "Goodbye," he repeated. "Let me kiss you once more at parting, even if I kiss Lord Paulyn's plighted wife." He took her in his arms, she coldly submissive with an almost apathetic air. Was it not time for her to speak, to justify herself, to declare that there was no stranger in all the wide city farther from her heart than Reginald Paulyn? "No," answered Pride. It would be time enough to enlighten him when he came back to her tomorrow and sued for pardon. She would not defend herself. She would not stoop to be forgiven. Had she not humiliated herself too much already for his sake, when she gave him the love he had never asked? "This time I will hold my own against him," she thought. "I will not be forever humbling myself in the very dust at his feet. From the beginning I have loved him with too slavish a love." He touched her forehead with his lips, the passionless kiss of forgiveness for a great wrong. It was the ruin of his air-built castle of earthly hope for which he pardoned her in that last kiss. Before him, wide and far-reaching as the summer sea that he had looked upon a few days ago from a grassy peak among the Pentlands, stretched a nobler prospect, a grander future than her love could ever have helped him to win, and hopes that were not earthbound. Surely he was resigning very little in his surrender of the one woman he had loved with a love beyond control. And yet the parting tore his heartstrings as they had never been strained before. Not even when he stood by the deathbed of Alice Fraser. "I am not destined to be fortunate in my loves," he said bitterly, the memory of that older anguish mingling curiously with his pain today. "Let me try to hope that I have a better destiny than mere earthly happiness." The qualifying adjective jarred a little upon her ear. He had always set her so low. He had always loved her grudgingly, with a reservation of his better self, giving her only half his heart at best. "You have been a great deal too good for me," she said with exceeding bitterness, "and you have taken care that I should feel your superiority. It is not given to every woman to be like your first love, simply perfect, and I have some reason to be grateful to those worldly-minded people who are willing to accept me for what I am. Lord Paulyn, for instance," said Mr. Forde, becoming very worldly in a moment, his eyes lighting up angrily. "Lord Paulyn, who has made his adoration of you a fact notorious to all the world. It is something to have one constant admirer. Lord Paulyn is at least not ashamed of admiring me. He does not fight against the sentiment as a weakness unworthy of his manhood. He does not feel himself degraded by his attachment." This sounded like a direct avowal of the Viscount's affection, and of her acceptance thereof. Surely no woman would speak in this manner except of an accepted lover. If Malcolm Forde had fondly hoped for denial, for a tardy attempt at justification, this unqualified submission was sufficient to enlighten him. "I did not come here to bandy words, Miss Luttrell," he said, drawing himself up stiffly, "but I will not leave you without repeating a warning I gave you once before. If you set any value upon your peace on earth, or your fitness for heaven, since a woman is in some measure the slave of her surroundings, do not marry Lord Paulyn. I am not apt to go in the way of scandal, but I have heard enough of his career to justify me in declaring that union with him would be the quickest road that you could take to lifelong misery. Yet you advised me just now to marry him. Rather inconsistent, is it not? Anger is always inconsistent. It was passion that spoke then. It is reason that pleads now. Do not let foolish friends persuade you to your ruin, Miss Luttrell. Your beauty may win as good a position as Lord Paulyn can give you from a much better man. If you are patient, and wait a little while for that brilliant establishment which you have no doubt been taught to consider the summit of earthly felicity. Your advice is as insulting as every word you have said this morning, cried Elizabeth in a burst of passion. Forgive me, he said with extreme gentleness. I did wrong to speak bitterly. It is not your fault if you have been schooled by worldly teachers. Believe me, it was of your own welfare, your future on this earth and in the world beyond, I was thinking. Oh, Elizabeth, I know that it is in your power to become a good woman, that it is in your nature to be pure and noble. It is only your surroundings that are false. Let my last memory of you be one of peace and friendship, and let your memory of me be of one who once dearly loved you, and to the last had your happiness at heart. His softened tone set her heart beating with a new hope. That phrase, once loved you, froze it again, and held her silent as death. A dull blank shadow crept over her face. She stood looking at the ground, only just able to stand. When she looked up, with a blinding mist before her eyes, he was gone, and dimly perceiving the empty space which he had filled, and feeling in a moment that he had vanished out of her life forever, the numbness of despair came over her, and she fell senseless across the spot where he had stood. End of Book 2, Chapter 6. Recording by John Braddon. Book 2, Chapter 7 of Strangers and Pilgrims. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Braddon. Strangers and Pilgrims by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Book 2, Chapter 7. The good explore. For peace those realms where guilt can never soar. The proud, the wayward, who have fixed below their joy and find this earth enough for woe. Loss in that one, their all, perchance a might, but who in patience parts with all delight. Mrs. Chevenix, descending to her drawing-room in state after the restorative effects of a leisurely breakfast in bed, and a gradual and easy toilet, her dress prepared for the reception of morning callers, her complexion refreshed with violet powder, was horrified at finding her niece prostrate on the threshold of the back drawing-room. But when Mrs. Chevenix and her maid had administered the usual remedies with a good deal of rushing to and fro, and the girl's haggard eyes reopened on the outer world, her first care was to assure them that the fainting fit was of no importance. She had been a little over-fatigued last night, that was all. "I can't imagine what made you get up so preposterously early this morning, child," said Mrs. Chevenix rather impatiently, "instead of trying to recruit your strength, as any sensible young woman would have done. How can you expect your complexion to last, if you go on in this way? You are as dark under the eyes as if you had not slept an hour for the last fortnight. Good looks are very well in their way, Elizabeth, But they won't stand such treatment as this. Go up to your room and lie down for an hour or two, and let Mason give you one of my globules." Elizabeth shrugged her shoulders impatiently. Globules for the cure of her disease? Infinitesimal doses for the healing of that great agony? How foolish a thing this second childishness of comfortable and motionless middle age is! This fool's paradise of pet poodles and homeopathy. This empty senile existence, which remains for some men and women when feeling and passion are dead and gone. "You know I don't believe in homeopathic medicine," she said, turning her tired head aside upon the pillow of the sofa where they had laid her, with a look of utter weariness and disgust. "Or in any other medicines, indeed. I was never ill in my life that I can remember, and I am not ill now. Let me lie here. I feel as if I could never get up again as long as I live." "A natural consequence of over-excitement," said Mrs. Chevenix. "Shut the folding doors, Mason, in case any one should call, and bring Miss Luttrell the cover-peed from the sofa in my bedroom. You shall have a mutton chop and a pint of Moselle for your luncheon, Lizzie, and if Lord Paulyn should come before luncheon, I shan't allow him to see you." "Lord Paulyn!" cried the girl with a shiver. "Let me never hear his name again as long as I live. He has broken my heart." Mrs. Chevenix received this wild assertion with a stony stare of bewilderment. "My dearest Lizzie, what are you dreaming of?" she exclaimed, pleased to think that Mason had departed in quest of the couvre-pied before this strange utterance. "I am sure that poor young man is perfectly devoted to you." "Who wants his devotion?" cried Elizabeth impatiently. "Has he ever been anything but a torment to me?" "Oh, yes, I know what you're going to say," she exclaimed, interrupting Aunt Chevenix's half-uttered exclamation. "In that case, why did I encourage his attentions? If I did so, I hardly knew that I was encouraging them. It was rather pleasant to feel that other people thought a great deal more of me on account of his silly infatuation, and he is not the kind of man who would ever be much the worse for any disappointment in that way. It would be too preposterous to suppose that he has a heart capable of feeling deeply about anything except racehorses." This was said half listlessly, yet with an air which implied that the speaker was trying to justify herself, and was half doubtful of the force of her own reasoning. "No heart!" ejaculated Mrs. Chevenix indignantly. "Why, I do believe that young man is all heart. I'm sure the warmth of his attachment to you is a very strong proof of it. No heart, indeed! If you had spoken of your tall curate now, with his rigid puritanical expression of countenance, just the look of an what's-his-name, a man who would chop the noses off the saints on the carved doors of a cathedral, I should think. If you had talked of his having no heart, I might have agreed with you." "Aunt Chevenix," said Elizabeth, starting up from her pillow, "if you ever dare to say one word in disparagement of Malcolm Forde, I shall hate you. I am almost tempted to hate you as it is, for being at the root of all my misery. Don't put your finger upon an open wound. You have no occasion to run him down now. He is nothing more to me. He came here this morning, not an hour ago, to give me up. I meant to tell you nothing about this, but you would have found it out somehow, I dare say, before long, and it is just as well that you should know at once. He came to give me up of his own accord. Our dream of happiness was very short, was it not? And he has ended it of his own free will. It would hardly have seemed so strange if I had been tempted away from him, for so far as the offer of a brilliant position in this world can tempt a penniless parson's daughter, I have been tempted. Yet heaven knows my faith never wavered for a moment. But he had heard something about Lord Paulyn and me, had seen some silly paragraph in the newspaper, and came to give me up. Even if I had been inclined to exculpate myself, he gave me no opportunity. he would hardly let me speak, and it was not for me to supplicate for a hearing, so I let him go without an effort to detain him, almost as coldly as he renounced me." "And you acted like a woman of spirit in so doing," cried Mrs. Chevenix triumphantly. Indeed, nothing could be more delightful to her than this intelligence. "Sue to him, indeed! Exculpate yourself to him! That would be rather too much. I congratulate you, my dear girl, upon having released yourself from a most unfortunate and mistaken engagement." "It might have been all that," said the girl, shrinking from her aunt's soothing caress with a shiver. "But unluckily I love the man. I loved you once," she repeated dreamily, going back to her interview with Malcolm Forde. "Oh God, that I should live to hear him say that! I loved you once." "My dearest child, it was not in human nature that such an engagement as that could endure. You, handsome, accomplished, admired, with peculiar opportunities of social success, this with a swelling pride in that dainty little establishment in Eaton Place South, and in herself as the sole source of these opportunities. He, an obscure provincial curate, a man who, entering the church somewhat late in life, has actually started at a disadvantage, not even a particularly agreeable or good-looking person, and I feel sure that when reason and experience have come to your aid, Lizzie, you will confess the baselessness of your infatuation. When experience has made me a hard, worldly old woman like Lady Paulyn, I may begin to see things in that light," said Elizabeth bitterly. "But please don't talk to me any more about Mr. Forde. Respect his name as you would if he were dead." "As if he were dead," she repeated. "Could I be any more unhappy if he were lying in his grave?" "Do not be afraid that I shall talk of the man," exclaimed Mrs. Chevenix indignantly. "I am too much disgusted with his conduct to choose the very time in which his prospects began to improve, as I conclude his uncle has left him something to throw you off. However, I thank Providence that your future may be 50 times more brilliant than any position which he could offer you at his best." Elizabeth said nothing, but sat with fixed eyes, staring at empty space. Could it be that he was indeed dead to her? That he would not come back? Oh, surely not. That parting could not be final. It was not possible that he could pluck her from his heart so easily. She, who on her side felt as if she were verily a part of himself, a mere subordinate being that could have no existence without him. She felt all this in spite of her season of independent pleasure, in spite of these last few months in which he had had no share in her life. Her lower instincts had been gratified by those vanities and dissipations. The nobler half of her being belonged to him, and held itself apart from all the world besides. "He will come back to me," she said to herself. "If I had not thought that, I could never have let him go. I should have grovelled at his feet, thrown myself between him and the door, clung to him as a shipwrecked sailor clings to a floating spar, rather than let him leave me forever." Buoyed up by this belief, Elizabeth supported her existence with a tolerable show of calm, was even able to go to a dinner party that evening, a dinner in Montague Square, at which there was no fear of meeting Lord Paulyn, looked very lovely in spite of her pallor, if not her best, sang and talked and laughed with that low melodious laugh which was one of her fascinations, and altogether delighted Mrs. Chevenix, who had expected to see her niece stricken down utterly for a day or two. "He will come back to me," the girl was saying to herself all that evening. "There will be a letter, perhaps, waiting for me when we go home." All that day she had been expecting his return, or at least some tender, remorseful letter, but the day had passed, and he had made no signs. Then she told herself that his anger could hardly cool all at once. He had been very angry, no doubt, though he had borne himself like a rock. Not all at once could he discover how essential she was to his life, how eager she was for the return to Eaton Place, how more than usually wearisome seemed that endless small talk about flower shows and picture galleries and opera singers and classical music. She fancied how the letter would be handed to her by her aunt's serving man, the dear letter with its superscription in that noble hand. How she would snatch it from the salver and run up to her own room to devour its contents in happy solitude. She could almost fancy how it would begin. "My dearest, forgive me." They were at home at last, but the serving man, who looked sleepy, brought her no salver. "Any letters, Plummer?" she asked, with a well-assumed carelessness. "No, ma'am." "Did you expect anything particular?" Mrs. Chevenix inquired. "No, only I thought there might have been one from Gerty or Di." "What can people at Hawleigh have to write about?" said her aunt contemptuously. The girl went straight to her room, heartsick. "He will come back to me tomorrow," she said. Tomorrow came, but brought no tidings of Malcolm Forde. A dreary day, the longest Elizabeth ever remembered in her life, which had contained many days that were dull enough and blank enough in all conscience. Lord Paulyn came, as he had come on the previous afternoon, but he was not allowed to see Miss Luttrell. She was ill, Miss Chevenix told him, really prostrate. Such a sensitive nature. Dear Lord Paulyn, so much imagination. The excitement of that play was too much for her. I'm afraid I must take her down to Brighton for change of air." The Viscount departed unwillingly, displeased at this interruption of his smaller pleasures, the trifling talk and tea-drinking in the hour he had wont of old to devote to more masculine diversions, horsey talk at a horsey club, or a lounge at Tattersall's. But although he was thus banished by the diplomatic matron, Elizabeth was not really ill. She was only white and wan, with blank tearless eyes, the living image of despair, not in a condition to be seen by a young nobleman who aspired to decorate her brow with a coronet, a lifeless creature whose tenure of happiness hung on a thread. Would he come or write? Would he forgive her and take her back to his heart? "Why did I ever come to London?" she asked herself with a curious wonder at her own folly. The cup of pleasure, being drained to the dregs, had left an after flavour of exceeding bitterness. She looked back to those sweet peaceful days at Hawleigh, to that springtime of life and love, when her heart had been exultant with a girl's triumph in her first important conquest, and remembered how averse Malcolm Forde had been to the idea of this visit, and for such empty trifles, for the vapid pleasures of a London season, a few balls, a few picnics, at best only the old Hawleigh dances and picnics upon a larger scale. She had jeopardized that dearest treasure for so childish a vanity as seeing this unknown world of good society. She had imperilled and lost the confidence of her lover. Other tomorrows came and faded, and still there was no sign of relenting on the part of Malcolm Forde. And still the girl's white face and absent manner forbade the admission of visitors. Lord Paulyn was impatient, sullen even, with a sense of injury, as if he had been an accepted lover unduly kept at bay. Upon one particular afternoon, feeling his disappointment acutely, he had brought a fresh bouquet of stephanotis and maidenhair every afternoon, waxen blossoms which had bloomed and languished unheeded by Elizabeth's dull eyes. He gave free utterance to his vexation, and in a communicative mood poured his griefs into the maternal bosom of Mrs. Chevenix. It was uncommonly hard, he urged, that after all he had put up with and gone through, the amount of nonsense he had stood from Miss Luttrell, She should throw him over the bridge for a parson fellow like that man at Hawleigh. "My dear Lord Paulyn," replied Mrs. Chevenix with a confidential air, bending her head a little nearer to the young man, as he sat a cheval on his favourite pouf, and by that gracious movement besprinkling him lightly with powder de Marechal, "that engagement is one which I have a secret conviction cannot be enduring. If I had not entertained such an opinion, I should never have encouraged, I will go farther, and say I would never have sanctioned your frequent presence in this house. No," this with a lofty air as of sublimest virtue, "I have too much regard for what is due to myself as well as to you. I am no slave of rank or wealth. If I did not think that you were eminently suited to my niece, and Mr. Forde as eminently unsuited to her, I should not have lent my support to an intimacy which could have but one result. Elizabeth is a girl whom to know is to love." "I'm not sure about that," said the young man, not deeply moved by this solemn address. "She's rather a queer girl, take her altogether. Fools a man to the top of his bent one day, and snubs him the next. Gives herself no end of airs, as if the world and everybody in it had been made to order for her, but she's the handsomest woman in London, and she has a peculiar way of her own that no man could stand against. I hadn't known her a fortnight before I made up my mind I'd marry her, but I didn't go to work rashly for all that. I left Hawleigh without committing myself. Gave myself time to find out if it was a serious case with me." Mrs. Chevenix gave a little impatient sigh. "If you had been a shade less cautious, and had spoken out at once, you might have prevented this foolish affair with Mr. Forde," she said. "Yes, but I pride myself upon knowing what I'm about, not putting my horse at a fence unless I know what's on the other side of it. And the worst of this Forde business is that she's desperately fond of him, has owned as much to me, and gloried in owning it." "A girl's delusion," said Mrs. Chevenix soothingly, "the romance of an hour, which will vanish like a summer cloud when the charm of novelty is gone. She has some foolish exalted idea of Mr. Forde's character, a half-religious hallucination that is not likely to last long." "I hope not," replied the Viscount in his matter-of-fact way. "At any rate, I mean to stand my ground, only it's rather wearing for a man's temper. I wanted the whole business settled and done with by the end of the season. I've all manner of engagements for my yachts and stable. I must be at Goodwood at the end of this month, and I've a sailing match at Havre the first week in August. Then come German steeplechases. I've wasted more time than I ever wasted in my life before upon this affair." "Be assured of my entire sympathy," murmured Mrs. Chevenix. "Of course I know you are all there," answered the hapless lover carelessly. "I've known all along you'd be on my side. It isn't likely you'd back that platter," by which contemptuous epithet he described his rival, "but I should like to see the wind-up of this engagement, or," almost savagely, "I should like to get Elizabeth Luttrell out of my head, and be my own man again." Mrs. Chevenix shuddered. This hint of a sudden wrench, a violent effort to emancipate himself on the part of the Viscount, filled her soul with consternation. "I'm doing very wrong," she exclaimed with a sudden gush of friendship. "It is a breach of confidence for which I shall hardly be able to forgive myself, but I can't bear to see you suffer, and to withhold knowledge that might be consolatory. I have reason to believe that the engagement between my niece and Mr. Forde is at an end." "What!" cried Reginald Paulyn. "She has thrown him off? She has served him as she serves everybody else, blown hot one day and cold the next?" "I have reason to believe that they have quarrelled," Mrs. Chevenix said mysteriously. "What! Has she seen him lately?" "She has, and since I have gone so far, On the impulse of the moment, prompted only by my sympathy with your depth of feeling, I must still go farther. The quarrel was about you. Mr. Forde had seen some paragraph associating your names, a marriage in high life, something absurd of that kind. Yes, I know. Cinqmars showed me the newspaper. It was his doing, I fancy. Mrs. Cinqmars has taken me under her wing, and no doubt inspired the paragraph with the notion that it might bring matters to a crisis. It has produced a crisis, said Mrs. Chevenix solemnly, and a very painful one for Elizabeth. The poor girl is utterly crushed. She was so fond of that beggar, uttered Lord Paulyn gloomily. Perhaps not so much on that account as for the humiliation involved in such an idea. To be accused of having played fast and loose, of having encouraged your attentions while she was engaged to him. And now between you both she finds herself abandoned, standing alone in the world, perhaps the mark for slander. Abandoned, standing alone, cried Lord Paulyn, starting up from his low chair, as if he would have rushed off at once in quest of a marriage license. Why, she must know that I am ready to marry her to-morrow. This was just the point at which Mrs. Chevenix could afford to leave him. My dear young friend, she exclaimed, moderate your feelings, I entreat. She is not a girl to be taken by storm. Let her recover from the shock she has received. Then, while her heart is still sore, wounded, weary with a sense of its own emptiness, then urge your suit once more, and I have little doubt that you will conquer. That the contrast between your generous, all-confiding affection and Mr. Forde's jealous tyranny will awaken the purest and truest emotions of her heart. This was a more exalted style of language than Reginald Paulyn cared about, a kind of thing which, in his own simple and forcible vocabulary, he denominated humbug. But the main fact was pleasing to him. Elizabeth had dismissed or had been deserted by her plighted lover. The ground was cleared for himself. End of Book 2, Chapter 7. Recording by John Braddon.